My name is Francisco. I'm 25 years old and I live on my family's farm, helping to take care of it when my parents are out of town. It's just a small family farm, not commercial or anything like that. My parents want me to inherit it when they can no longer manage it, since I'm the oldest of 3 siblings and the only son. But honestly, I'm not too keen on the idea. I can't see myself staying in rural Arkansas for my entire life, especially after something really strange happened last July. My parents were on a romantic trip for a week, so my 2 sisters, Maria and Sophia, and I were looking after the property while they were away. It's quite secluded here, a lot of privacy, perhaps too much in my opinion. However, that night everything changed. It began late in the evening as we were getting ready to go to bed. Maria was in her room taking online summer courses, and Sophia and I were watching a silly series in the living room. All 3 of us wanted to leave the farm life behind, especially me, since I'm the oldest and in the prime of my life. One of the most dreaded parts of farm life is the predators, not just the animals that eat your crops, but also the people who come to steal. You might not believe it, but it happens. It hasn't happened to us many times, but it does happen. We keep some weapons in the house for this very reason. Suddenly, our 2 dogs outside started going crazy in the backyard. Something scared them. I ran outside to see what they were barking at. Both dogs were staring at the crops, barking like mad. I shouted at them to be quiet, and they fell silent. I approached the crops and heard a whistle from within the cornfield, a definitely human whistle. It was the first time I encountered an intruder on the property without my father being there. I had to run inside to grab one of the guns. The dogs started barking again. I told my sisters that someone was outside in the cornfield and that I had to scare them off. Both said it was a terrible idea to go into the cornfield in the dark and made me see that they were right. I also realized how terrifying it would be. Instead, I went back to the backyard where the dogs were still barking towards the crops. I aimed the gun into the air and fired a shot that echoed through the night, silencing the dogs. At that moment, I felt powerful and yelled as loud as I could for the intruder to get off our land before going back inside. My sisters laughed, which made me laugh too, but our laughter soon stopped because the dogs went crazy again, this time even more so. I ran out again, ready to do the same, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw a man about 20 feet from the dogs, just in front of the cornfield. He looked at me and I yelled at him, at which point he ran into the cornfield. I started to run towards it and fired another shot into the air. I stopped next to the dogs. I had no intention of going in there. I also wasn't going to leave the dogs outside, so I unhooked their leashes and took them inside the house. I told my sisters that someone was lurking around the cornfield. So, what did we do? We called Dad. He told me I had to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He recommended firing another warning shot if the intruder returned. After that, we all went to our respective rooms. My sisters took the dogs with them, and I brought the gun to my room because we were all a bit scared. I left the window open, and while I was lying down watching a movie on my laptop, I heard a whistle from outside. I rushed to the window and saw someone walking slowly across the lawn. Then, as if he had a sixth sense, he stopped and looked up at my window, still whistling. This guy was obviously trying to scare us and pull off some kind of horror prank, which was a pretty stupid idea considering I had already made it clear that I had a gun. I ran to grab the gun from my bed and aimed it out the window. I fired at the grass a few meters away from him, clearly not intending to hurt him. This ended his little horror movie act, and he ran out of sight from my window towards the front of the house. This time he did not come back. He would have to be a fool to return after that. Obviously, I told my sisters why I fired and assured them that he wouldn't come back. We never found out who it was or why he did it. It could have been a teenager or several teenagers trying to scare some innocent farmers for fun, or it could have been someone genuinely dangerous. My wife Carmen and I own a farm in Buckinghawa where we mainly grow corn. This happened in August 2018 on a slightly rainy night. Carmen and I have spent our entire lives farming. It's really all we know. Of course, farm life in Iowa means lots of space and very few people. Our nearest neighbors, Jorge and Carlos, were each about half a mile away in opposite directions. They were also farmers. and there wasn't much else to do around here. It's easy to become friends with your neighbors. We often invited Jorge and Carlos and their wives over, and vice versa. On this otherwise normal night, we had Jorge and his wife over for drinks. We all got pretty drunk while playing board games, and they left around 11 p.m. Fortunately, their house was just a 30-second straight line away. We continued drinking wine while watching one of our favorite movies. We started to feel tired, and were definitely feeling the effects of the wine. We were probably going to fall asleep on the sofa cuddled up when there was a knock at the front door. A knock at that hour was unusual. In fact, it had never happened before. But along with the knocks, we thought we could hear a voice saying something. I turned down the volume of the TV and waited for it to happen again. About 20 seconds later, another set of knocks on the door, followed by a muffled voice saying, "We need help." I was about to get up and open the door when Carmen grabbed my arm and looked at me. She grimaced and shook her head. I whispered, "I'm just going to ask who it is." She replied, "We shouldn't let them know we're home, but they probably already know we are." I approached the door and asked, "Who is it?" The voice on the other side said through the door, "Oh, thank God, can you open? We're lost." I asked, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "My wife and I." I retorted, "Can your wife say something?" There was silence for a few seconds, then I said, "Did you hear me?" The same voice replied, "Yes, but she's not beside me right now." It was at that moment I started to feel alarm bells ringing, and I realized the voice sounded a bit strange, like a man trying to make his voice sound a bit higher. I laughed and said, "You're Jorge, aren't you?" Jorge is a big joker, and being drunk, it wouldn't be unusual for him to do something like this. The voice replied, "Yes," now with a slightly deeper voice. I almost felt relief, thinking it really was Jorge, but I still didn't want to open the door without confirming. Someone knocking on your door here, late at night, saying they're lost. It's not something that happens, it's not normal, and it's an immediate cause for alarm. I told them through the door, "Prove it. What's the name of your wife?" An unknown voice now replied, "That's a trick question." My smile disappeared. I went to fetch my phone and called Jorge. Carmen watched the whole situation and suggested we should call the police. I told her to wait. The phone rang 3 times before Jorge answered. I immediately asked him, "Are you at my front door right now?" He replied, "No, why?" I told him there was someone at our front door trying to trick me into opening it. He said he'd come over quickly, and we hung up. Keep in mind we were all still drunk during this. There were more knocks at the door, and I shouted, "I have a shotgun waiting for you if you don't leave now." The voice replied, "We're just trying to use a phone, that's all we need." Carmen called 911, which, by the way, here in this place takes an extremely long time for an officer to arrive. The human voices continued. They were laughing and shouting. The laughter affected me the most. It was an ugly laugh, not the kind that sounds like people are having fun. At some point, I felt like someone was approaching our campsite. I got scared and stayed completely still. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, and I fell asleep again. I woke up early in the morning. My friend was already awake. I asked him if he had heard the noise, but he said no. I wondered if it had all been a dream. Then I saw something in the lake. A man was standing there on some sort of rudimentary raft, about 200 meters away from us, looking in our direction. I couldn't make out any facial features. He looked pale. My heart started beating faster. The man stayed there for a long time. My friends Juan Miguel, Adrian, and I decided to spend a week in the forest. We went to a cabin owned by Adrian's dad, and the area was spectacular. There was a hunting platform in a tree and a creek not far south of the cabin. We all went to the creek to fish. Juan pointed out a decent-sized snake at the fishing spot, and we all thought that was pretty cool. Miguel took a photo just as a hawk swooped down and grabbed it, which was both impressive and a bit alarming. On our way back to the cabin to cook hot dogs, we saw many deer to the left and right of the trail. But the most notable one was extremely tall. We could only see its head behind one of the trees, but it stood a few meters taller than a typical deer. The thing was watching us, which was odd. It was the first deer I'd seen that didn't just run away upon seeing humans. Miguel and Adrian were just looking at it, but Juan, for some reason, was trying to lure the deer towards us until I said, "It's not a damn dog." We continued walking back to the cabin. When we got there, we lit the fire for the hot dogs, and Miguel and I had a little tomahawk throwing competition at a dead tree while waiting for the food. Juan was smoking a cigarette. The evening was pretty normal. We ate well and drank a bit, but keep in mind none of us were drunk. I don't think any of us had finished our second drink yet. We started talking about the seemingly fearless deer we had seen. Adrian said he was examining the deer when he noticed something we didn't. According to him, the deer was much larger than normal, claiming it was the size of a horse. We dismissed this as simply a rare specimen that happened to be that large. Around midnight, we all went into the cabin to settle in. I was sleeping pretty well until I heard something outside. It sounded like a deer call, but deeper and right beside the cabin. The sound got closer and closer, and then I saw a face in my window. It was the head of a deer. I could make out large antlers, and when it opened its mouth to breathe, I saw teeth that shouldn't have been so sharp, teeth that didn't fit in a deer's mouth. Whatever it was over 2 meters tall because its head reached the top of the window and its antlers extended above it. For comparison, I'm 190 meters tall, and from inside the cabin, you'd only see the top of my head if I stood outside the window. I don't think the thing saw me because it stayed there for a while. Eventually, it moved away from my window and I thought it had gone. But not 2 minutes passed when I heard someone scream. It was Juan. We all woke up and ran to Juan's room. He told us something big had stuck its arm through his open window trying to get in, trying to reach him. Then I admitted my story too, telling everyone about the face I had just seen in my window. Adrian rushed to close all the doors and windows. Meanwhile, we kept hearing that distorted deer call coming from right outside. Then we began to hear banging on the walls and the cabin doors. I don't know exactly what it was, but I knew it wanted something. It was doing everything it could to get in, to reach us. We weren't going to go out. Our only hope was daylight, hoping it would leave by then, and if it didn't, I don't know what we were going to do. Fortunately, Adrian's dad had allowed him to bring his shotgun to the cabin, so we felt a bit safer. By morning, there were no signs of the creature. We went outside only to find hoof prints the size of a large man's feet and deep claw marks on the door. We also found dead deer on the cabin roof. We didn't stay much longer there. We got out of those woods as soon as we could. Since then, Adrian and Miguel have only gone back a couple of times. As for Juan and I, we haven't been back to that cabin since the event. Miguel has been having trouble sleeping. He seems unable to get over it. And Juan is more nervous and jumpy than ever. The carnivorous deer man. We hope we never run into him again. I was 8 years old in the summer of 2009 when my parents and I decided to stay in a cabin at a campsite called Quinua for about a week. We had many great times there before. Dan and I used to camp on an island in the huge lake and go fishing. But this time would be different. The cabins we stayed in had a spare bed, and we had a lot of fun on our first day. I remember riding my bike along the path leading to the cabins and feeling the excitement of being back in Quinua. That night, before falling asleep, I was reading a book for about 20 minutes. I woke up later. I don't know how much time had passed, and the room was completely dark. I simply couldn't fall back asleep, no idea why. I lay there for a while, closing my eyes and shifting positions, trying to fall asleep again. Finally, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the worst and most horrible sound I've ever heard in my life. The best way to describe it is as a deep, demonic laugh, and to my horror, it was followed by the sound of something climbing up the wooden staircase. I screamed for my parents, and the climbing stopped suddenly. I was crying uncontrollably and told them what had happened. They saw or heard nothing and thought I had just had a nightmare. I ended up sleeping with my mom for the rest of the trip, but I still couldn't sleep well that night. I also had difficulties on subsequent nights and to this day in my own bunk bed. I can't sleep on the top, It just scares me too much. I want to believe it was just my imagination. Sometimes it can play tricks on you. But on the other hand, the thought of what might have been climbing that staircase horrifies me. I don't think I would want to see it. It was the end of 1996 in a new subdivision in an area called Pinnacle Peak, just north of Phoenix, Arizona. Our home was pretty much developed right on the edge of the fresh desert with stunning rocky peaks nearby. The desert was actually federal land, and at that time people weren't really supposed to venture there. But I was a teenager in my junior year of high school, and I loved riding my bike around there looking for scorpions. Soon, I made a new friend who lived about 2 miles away on the other side of the desert. We often went to a particular spot where there was a small nook on the side of the peak. It was a cool place where we loved to hang out. Now, I realize how scary it was to be there with rattlesnakes, scorpions, and cacti that stuck to you like hooks. Once we ran into a couple of guys driving an old truck who stopped right in front of my bike, blocking their way. They threatened to run over my bike and us if we didn't move it. My friend moved it. I didn't say anything and just moved it out of the way. But yes, it was quite a dangerous place. My friend and I would roll huge rocks from the top of the peak, watching them tumble down and crush everything below. It was fun to watch, though at the time we didn't think about the danger. I would shoot small stones with my slingshot at other rocks, and pretty much anything around us. Later on, that friend of mine moved to Florida, and would occasionally come back, but I usually went there alone. One day I picked up some jumping cacti to plant one in my garden, because we had some crazy neighbors who were fighting with the homeowners association over their solar panels on the roof. This guy and his kids would graffiti the fences and act violently towards the neighbors. So I thought I'd plant these nasty cacti under the fence, and if they crossed over, they'd be in for a prickly surprise. Anyway, while I was collecting the cacti, an unmarked black helicopter suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Something in my mind told me to get out of there immediately, so I jumped on my bike and rode as fast as I could back home, even though it was over 2 miles away. Eventually, I got home and ran to the pool, plunging my head in because I was about to have a heat stroke. Moments later, that same helicopter was hovering right above our backyard. I didn't look up even once. I stayed calm and petted my dog. After a minute or two, it left, but it was really strange. I should add that behind the area where I was, there was a shooting range from Luke Air Force Base, but here's where the real story begins. Soon after this, I started experiencing really strange things while I slept. I'm talking about suddenly waking up and finding myself violently hitting my pillow against something without knowing why. It happened many times, and often I noticed a blurry, ghostly face or figure that disappeared as soon as I realized something was there. Later, I graduated and started a graphic design school in Tempe, Arizona. I drove from my parents' house to school very early in the morning, and once there, I'd sleep a couple of hours in the car before school started. One day, I woke up and saw a figure next to my window. I got scared and was completely awake, but my eyes closed again and I couldn't open them. I had a knife in the door, so I tried to grab it, but I couldn't move at all. Moments later, I finally managed to free myself, but I couldn't understand how it had happened. Years passed and I moved back to Washington State where I grew up, and my parents had also moved there while I was in school. Later, I met a woman, and we got married in 2001. I continued having the same experiences with ghostly apparitions every few months, and even a couple of times my wife had witnessed the same things. We had fascinating conversations about my sleep. She often saw me sitting up in bed with my eyes wide open, speaking in some ancient-sounding language. Usually she'd nudge me and tell me to go back to bed, and apparently, I would obey. We laughed it off, thinking it was just harmless sleepwalking. By 2004, we moved to Texas. At the end of 2003, we rented a small cedar cabin in Smithville, Texas. My wife worked for the airlines and wouldn't get home until midnight or 3 a.m. Well, one night in June 2004, everything was about to change forever. I finished my work and got home around 9 p.m. I was relaxing and listening to music. I fell asleep around 11:30 p.m., and my wife got home around 2:30 a.m. after I'd gone to bed. I have no memory of the events until I regained consciousness, which I will describe later in the incident. The following is from the perspective of my ex-wife. She describes that upon arriving at the cabin, she heard what seemed like dogs running around our cabin and growling, which scared her, and she quickly went inside. Once inside, she could hear more growling coming from our dark bedroom. She went to investigate, somewhat forgetting about the dog growls outside. She saw me standing on the bed in an inhuman, contorted way with my mouth hanging open and dark eyes. The room was very dark, but initially she didn't think much of it and thought I was just sleepwalking. She thought she could nudge me again, and I would simply lie back down as usual. She was very, very wrong. As she approached, she says I lunged at her like a predator and began to strangle her neck. She describes that she didn't even want to look at me, fearing that something truly evil and exceptionally malevolent had taken control of my body. She was so afraid for her life that she kicked me to push me away, but it didn't work. Even though she kept kicking, during this incident she was screaming for her life, calling my name and asking for help. Somehow, I finally managed to free myself from whatever was controlling me. It felt like my soul was being held captive, and I slowly regained control over the fading power that this thing had. I could hear the most horrible, gut-wrenching demonic screech that I had ever heard. I couldn't mimic it no matter how hard I tried. When I finally realized something awful was happening, I tried to tell her everything was okay now. But when I spoke, my voice wasn't my own. If you've ever seen the movie, The Mothman Prophecies, where Indrid Cold is on the phone talking with that low, creepy voice, that's how I sounded. And I remember her saying, "No, it's not okay, Hugh." A few minutes passed and I was completely free from what had just happened. Back to normal. Needless to say, I was absolutely terrified. We both were. We were both crying and knew that something had attacked us, something that wasn't just a dream or night terror. Somehow the bathroom door closed on its own during the incident, and my cat, Zebre, was running in circles, scared. Also, this cat loved me to death and had never been afraid of me until that night. All my strange experiences seemed to culminate in that cabin. My wife and I couldn't sleep that night. I had to work in the morning, and she went to church to get holy water, which she sprinkled around the cabin. We both prayed, although at that time I thought the idea of God and prayer was ridiculous. When I woke up in the morning and went outside, the air was chilly, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt like something was outside watching me, and it was angry. About 2 weeks later, I was home alone and suddenly woke up to see a statue of Apollo that we had bought at Walmart, except now its eyes were glowing blue. I thought it was the moonlight reflecting in them, so I grabbed it and took it into the dark. To my horror, the eyes still glowed. I refused to give in to fear and put it on the floor, covering it with a blanket, then went back to bed. After that, I never again experienced ghostly clouds over me, or sleep talking with my eyes open. Absolutely nothing. The only thing that remained after 2004 was that my relationship with my wife slowly crumbled. We had 2 children, and in 2010 we divorced. Now in my home, I hear knocks in the kitchen and sometimes in the hallways, but I don't feel threatened. I met with some paranormal experts in 2008 who believed it was possible that I had attracted a skinwalker in the Arizona desert due to my destructive or intrusive teenage nature, and that it had been following me all those years. All I know is that I'm not a Bible thumper and never will be, but there's nothing wrong with just believing in God and asking for help when needed. Keep in mind that negative energy feeds on fear. I've never drunk or used drugs of any kind, and before this I never had sleep issues. You could tell me I had night terrors, but I personally know it was much, much more than that. Sometimes you just have to have your own experience to know there's much more to our world than what meets the eye. This happened a long time ago in 2013 when I was in college. It was our annual art camp organized by the college's art department. All of us were from the fine arts department, and our organization hosted this art camp with seminars from our professors and mentors, as well as team-building activities. It was usually held in recreational places. That year, we were the officers of the organization, so we chose the location, planned the games and activities, among other things. The place was in a rural area near Laguna in the Philippines. It was a huge recreational space with a suspension bridge that led to the Campfire area the pool, and the obstacle courses. In the center of the place, there was a large event hall where the seminars took place. Our cabins were hidden among the trees located behind the hall. The first cabin was for the mentors and professors, the second for the girls of my year and office mates, the third for second-year students and freshmen, and the fourth for the boys of my year and some freshmen. The last two cabins were occupied by senior students. On the right side of the event hall, there was an outdoor seating area with a life-size chessboard. If you walked straight ahead, there was an obstacle course area, and further on, there was the pool and the wooded area where the camping and suspension bridge were located. This particular story was experienced by my classmates. It was already night, around 8 p.m., and our scheduled seminar had ended. Everyone had finished dinner. Some students were relaxing on the patio of their cabins. Others were strolling around, and we, the officers, were busy planning the activities for the next day. The guys, Gabri, Walter, Kevin, Alejandro, and Enrique, were chatting and relaxing inside their cabin. One of them decided to explore a bit, and Enrique suggested they go play in the chess area. Everyone left except one. Gabri approached Francisco, a freshman who was dozing on the top bunk, and asked if he wanted to join them. But Francisco was tired and declined, turning his back to them. Before leaving, Gabri asked Francisco if he could borrow his flip-flops since he hadn't brought his own. Francisco said yes, so the five guys left the cabin, laughing and joking. As they were about to reach the chessboard, Gabri noticed someone walking parallel to them. The person was heading toward the large old coconut tree next to the chessboard area. They were confused and stopped. Walter, Kevin, Alejandro, and Enrique also saw the person walking. It was already dark with only a few lights in the distance. Gabri rubbed his eyes and recognized the person walking. It was Francisco. They all shouted, "Francisco, come here!" Enrique noticed that Francisco had stopped and turned towards them without any expression. Alejandro was confused and asked if it was really Francisco. Gabri realized something was strange and turned to the guys, asking how Francisco could be out there and wearing his flip-flops. They all looked at the person they were calling, who then continued walking and suddenly disappeared behind the old tall coconut tree. The boys gasped collectively, ran and screamed as they rushed back to their cabin. When they reached the door, they opened it only to find Francisco deeply asleep with his headphones on. They woke him up with gentle taps to ask if he was okay, or if he had gone outside. Rubbing his eyes, Francisco, confused, said no. The five boys were so scared that they tried to outrun each other to our cabin to tell us what had happened. I was very scared but not surprised, as I had felt uneasy in that area during the night. I really felt that something strange was there. I had many experiences at night before but was unsure if they were paranormal. I was the only one awake at that moment. It was 2 a.m., and I heard laughter around our cabin as if children were running and chasing each other. I also noticed silhouettes passing by the screen doors. Personally, I tried to downplay it, thinking it was some student still awake and playing outside, but I couldn't sleep until 5 a.m. I believed that place had ghosts and strange elements in it. According to some students' accounts, you could easily tell if something creepy was in that place just by the vibes it gave off. When I was in college, a 25-year-old friend of mine told me a terrifying story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She is from Buffalo, New York, and used to go camping at local camps in upstate New York. In her senior year of high school, she and 4 of her friends went to a camp with rows of cabins by the water that people could rent. As night fell, the girls noticed their neighbors, a group of boys their age, playing music and dancing around a campfire, drinking beers. One of the boys asked if they wanted to join, and when they arrived and started hanging out with them, everything seemed completely normal and they were having fun. As the night progressed, one of the boys got drunk to the point of losing control of his actions and eventually pulled out a revolver, which he said belonged to his father. He started waving it around and playing with it, which obviously scared everyone, including his own friends. I laughed and said, "You're Jorge, aren't you?" Jorge is a big joker, and being drunk, it wouldn't be unusual for him to do something like this. The voice replied, "Yes," now with a slightly deeper voice. I almost felt relief, thinking it really was Jorge, but I still didn't want to open the door without confirming. Someone knocking on your door here, late at night, saying they're lost. It's not something that happens. It's not normal, and it's an immediate cause for alarm. I told them through the door, "Prove it. What's the name of your wife?" An unknown voice now replied, "That's a trick question." My smile disappeared. I went to fetch my phone and called Jorge. Carmen watched the whole situation and suggested we should call the police. I told her to wait. The phone rang 3 times before Jorge answered. I immediately asked him, "Are you at my front door right now?" He replied, "No, why?" I told him there was someone at our front door trying to trick me into opening it. He said he'd come over quickly and we hung up. Keep in mind we were all still drunk during this. There were more knocks at the door and I shouted, We had decided to take a 20-minute hike in Noping called Walking in the Ancient Mountains, which basically consisted of a climb to a huge rock that took you above the tree canopy, offering you a 360-degree view of the surrounding lakes and forests. There were a few picnic tables at the top for breakfast, and it was a magnificent spot to watch the sunrise. My boyfriend and I drove there, losing signal on the way, with the last thing we saw being a campsite about 22 kilometers down a gravel road before reaching our destination. We were quite isolated. We arrived at around 1 a.m., and since we had a bed in the back of our SUV, we could take a nap before starting the hike. We parked at the trailhead and got ready to sleep. We honked the horn, slammed the doors, and shouted to scare off any nearby animals like bears, before walking about 40 feet to the restroom. After all that, we got into bed, locked the doors, and the next moment we heard heavy footsteps on the gravel outside the car. Step, step, drag, step, step, drag. Paralyzed with fear for a moment, listening as the footsteps approached the car, I quickly crawled to the front seat, started the car, and pointed the lights around to see what was outside. But there was nothing. No footprints in the gravel. No signs of anything having been there. I took a quick drive around with the lights shining brightly into the surrounding bushes and saw nothing. We had decided to take a 20-minute hike in Noping called Walking in the Ancient Mountains, which basically consisted of a climb to a huge rock that took you above the tree canopy, offering you a 360-degree view of the surrounding lakes and forests. There were a few picnic tables at the top for breakfast, and it was a magnificent spot to watch the sunrise. My boyfriend and I drove there, losing signal on the way, with the last thing we saw being a campsite about 22 kilometers down a gravel road before reaching our destination. We were quite isolated. We arrived at around 1 a.m., and since we had a bed in the back of our SUV, we could take a nap before starting the hike. We parked at the trailhead and got ready to sleep. We honked the horn, slammed the doors, and shouted to scare off any nearby animals like bears, before walking about 40 feet to the restroom. After all that, we got into bed, locked the doors, and the next moment, we heard heavy footsteps on the gravel outside the car. Step, step, drag, step, step, drag. Paralyzed with fear for a moment, listening as the footsteps approached the car, I quickly crawled to the front seat, started the car, and pointed the lights around to see what was outside. But there was nothing. No footprints in the gravel. No signs of anything having been there. I took a quick drive around with the lights shining brightly into the surrounding bushes and saw nothing. Still terrified, I stayed awake for almost an hour, shining the lights and waiting for something to emerge. After not seeing anything, I assumed whatever it was had left and wouldn't come back. So, I turned off the lights and crawled back into the bed where my boyfriend was sleeping. No sooner had I laid my head down than we heard the footsteps again, this time walking from the rear wheel on the driver's side where my head was, around the trunk, to the wheel on my boyfriend's side. We looked out the windows, too scared to move, but saw nothing. Then suddenly there was a loud, slow scratching on the wheel next to my boyfriend's head. He banged on the car wall to scare it off, but it stayed nearby. After all this, I don't remember why we stayed and didn't just leave. Maybe at that moment we thought it was over since it was more than a 3-hour drive from Winnipeg to get there, and you'd hate to have wasted all that time. Anyway, we stayed. The footsteps and scratches continued almost all night, and once it started to get light enough to see our surroundings better, the sound stopped. We put on our headlamps and began our hike. It was too dark to see anything when we left. But once we returned from our breakfast at dawn on top of the rock, we saw that the tire where we had heard the scratches was flat. There was no explanation why. We changed it and headed home. But to this day, when I think about it, there's no animal I know of that behaves that way, with those heavy, specific footsteps that seemed like someone dragging something, maybe a body. I'm not a big believer in ghosts, but I've considered it as an option. Perhaps this large rock that juts out above the tree canopy was significant for indigenous peoples at some point. I can't be sure, but has anyone else had similar experiences in the wilds of Manitoba? In my hometown, there's a huge lake, a large and desolate place ideal for camping, fishing, and hunting. To give you some context, I live in Norway, where we have something called the right of access, which basically means you can roam freely anywhere in the country as long as it's not private property. Because of this, Norwegians love to explore nature, and with plenty of space for everyone, people generally don't crowd together. My friend and I were planning a camping trip. We were going to go up the river by boat and head to an island in the middle of the lake. When we got there, we found an ideal spot, probably previously used by other campers. Something that unsettled me a bit was a northern pike head hanging from a tree next to a campfire. It was huge and stared at the campsite with its dead, dry eyes. The real event happened after nightfall. We had been sitting around the campfire for hours, eating, drinking, and chatting. This was in summer, and summers in Norway aren't very dark due to the geographic location, but around 2 a.m., it was quite dark. However, I noticed something in the lake. I couldn't make out what it was and didn't really care. After a while, we went to our tents and slept. That night, I had some very strange dreams. I saw the pike move its eyes, making sounds. The sky changed colors. I saw a man in the lake, the water evaporating and condensing again. The pike said something to the river, and suddenly I woke up. I was sweating. I checked my phone. It was still night. I was only 14, my brain not fully developed, and underage drinking certainly didn't help. But I was scared. I had no idea why. It was the kind of fear where you just don't want to see anything. I didn't want to open the tent. I stayed completely still and pretended to be asleep. I heard noises, sounds from the dream, noises that the head in the tree had made. I stayed rigid, feeling the blood pumping through my body. Then I heard people screaming. The noises were no more than 100 meters away, and it was more than 100 meters to the mainland. The island we were on was small. You could probably walk around it in 5 minutes. The human voices continued. They were laughing and shouting. The laughter affected me the most. It was an ugly laugh, not the kind that sounds like people are having fun. At some point, I felt like someone was approaching our campsite. I got scared and stayed completely still. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, and I fell asleep again. I woke up early in the morning. My friend was already awake. I asked him if he had heard the noise, but he said no. I wondered if it had all been a dream. Then I saw something in the lake. A man was standing there on some sort of rudimentary raft, about 200 meters away from us, looking in our direction. I couldn't make out any facial features. He looked pale. My heart started beating faster. The man stayed there for a long time. We got so uneasy that we finally packed our things and went home. Luckily, we had a motorboat, so he could never catch up to us. I still remember the way he looked at us as we left the lake and headed for the river. He just stayed there. Later, I realized what I had seen in the lake in the darkness the previous night was probably him. He had been standing there the whole time. He was responsible for the sounds I heard. He knew we were alone on the small island, which wasn't really a place where drunk teenagers would go on spontaneous trips in the middle of the night. He put the fish head in the tree to scare people away. We had stepped on his territory or something. And perhaps most importantly, why was he standing there on a raft in the lake? Did he step onto the island while we were sleeping and plan to do something to us? And who was he shouting or laughing with? I have no answers to any of these questions, and I haven't gone back there since. Both my friend and I get a little nervous every time someone mentions the man on the raft. This story unfolds on my grandparents' farm during the summer of 2018. One night I found myself alone because my grandparents were away, and they had hired me to look after the farm for a couple of nights. On the last night, I was watching television in the living room when I began to hear a strange noise coming from the cornfield. Initially, I didn't pay much attention to it because I thought it was probably a deer, but then I heard all the cows mooing at the same time. Normally, you'd only hear one cow mooing at a time, but when all the cows started doing it simultaneously, I knew something was wrong. Something or someone must have scared them for all the cows to be disturbed like that. Being the only one on the farm, I knew it was my responsibility to find out what was happening. I went to the closet to grab a jacket and head outside, but just as I was about to leave, I heard a very sharp scream from a cow. I stood still for a while, shaking with fear. Something terrible was happening with the cows. I quickly ran upstairs to my grandfather's bedroom. He always keeps some weapons under his bed. I loaded his hunting rifle and ran outside. The cows were still making noise incessantly, so I entered the barn to check. Nothing was out of the ordinary. All the cows were there except for one that was missing from its stall. It didn't make sense. I was sure it was tied to the stall the last time I saw it. Then I thought I heard a sharp sound from a cow coming from the cornfield outside the barn, so I went out. As I walked towards the field, I could swear I heard what seemed to be people talking. I finally decided to fire 2 shots into the air. Everything went silent. The cows quieted down, and I couldn't hear anything from the field until I heard footsteps in it. I didn't know if I had the courage to enter the cornfield, but I had to do it. This is why farmers have weapons, and I couldn't just stay hidden in the house with intruders in the field. I started walking through the crops and could hear many pairs of footsteps beside me. I was getting even more scared as I moved deeper into the field, and then I froze. A few meters away from me, in one of the rows of corn, there was a person dressed in black. I raised my gun, telling him to get out of my field. I wasn't lying. I was ready to shoot, but he didn't move, not even an inch. Then he started walking towards me with his arms slightly extended, as if he was telling me to lower my gun. I aimed my gun at him again, shouting for him to back off. It was then I realized something horrible. He, along with the others, was wearing creepy masks. The man stopped approaching as I backed away, and everything was silent for a moment. I can't explain the fear I was experiencing. I thought I was about to be murdered. It was then that they all started to sing something. I couldn't understand what they were saying. It sounded like a different language, but the chants almost sounded like a song. I began to wonder if they were about to carry out some kind of sick ritual with me. It was then that I took the chance to run as fast as I could through several rows of corn. When I ran out of breath, I stopped and fired about 6 shots in their direction. I heard many footsteps and the sound of crops moving in the opposite direction. I finally scared them off and ran toward the direction of the farmhouse. I stopped when I saw something on the ground, and what I saw marked and horrified me. There was a cow's head in the center of a circle of candles. I wanted to vomit, and as soon as I got to the farmhouse, I did. I took the house phone and called the police, explaining the situation as best as I could. The operator said an officer would be on the way. After speaking with the police, I called my parents and explained the situation, asking them to come pick me up. My dad said he would be there in an hour. I sat upstairs in my grandfather's room, shaking and crying at the same time, waiting for what felt like an eternity until I finally heard a police car outside. I ran out to the officer and never felt so relieved in my life. I told everything to the officer, who searched the barn and then part of the cornfield. He found the cow's head and called a search team. When my parents arrived along with the first officer, they had a conversation with me about everything that had happened. Fortunately, my parents took me home after that. My grandparents took this very seriously and decided to install a high-tech security camera system all over the farm. Who knows what kind of group that was, but clearly, they were conducting some kind of animal sacrifice. I have always considered myself a practical farmer. My days started before dawn and ended long after the sun had set. The farm was my world, and every seed I planted, every crop I harvested represented a Herculean effort. But there was one problem that had been tormenting me for years: the crows. Those despicable black crows hovered over my fields day after day, pecking at my crops, devouring the seeds that took so much effort to plant. I had tried everything to get rid of them: nets, common scarecrows. I'd even spent hours shooting into the air to scare them away, but nothing seemed to work. Until one day, while I watched helplessly as a flock of crows feasted on my newly sprouted corn, a crazy idea crossed my mind. What if I created a scarecrow so spooky that no crow would dare come near it? I threw myself into the task with fierce dedication. I rummaged through the shed for materials and found an old wooden mannequin that had once belonged to a clothing store. Its arms and legs were articulated, which would make the task of making it look more realistic easier. I bought tattered clothes from the village store, and some old, muddy boots from my barn completed the look of a careless farmer. But what really made my creation stand out was its head. I used a large pumpkin that had grown strangely with a twisted expression resembling a creepy grin. I carved it an open mouth and a macabre smile and deep eyes that seemed to follow you with their gaze. That pumpkin became the face of my scarecrow. To give it a final touch, I covered it with a layer of worn red paint, as if it were bleeding all over. When I placed it in the center of the field, even I shuddered at the sight. It was the personification of terror. The first night after placing the scarecrow, I sat on my porch, watching with satisfaction as the crows perched in nearby trees but kept a prudent distance. My neighbors initially looked at me suspiciously and murmured that I was losing my mind. But as the crows continued to avoid my fields, their skepticism turned into amazement and admiration. All was well until I noticed something strange one morning when I went out to the field. I found black feathers scattered everywhere, as if there had been a fight. The scarecrow was on the ground with its head twisted to one side, as if someone or something had attacked it. I approached cautiously and lifted the pumpkin head, gasping when I saw what was underneath. It wasn't crows that had caused this. There were marks from human hands that had torn off the scarecrow's head and put it back in a grotesque position. My heart pounded as I looked around for someone who might have done this, but there was no one in sight, only the silence of the field. I felt a chill run down my spine, but attributed the situation to some vagrant or teenager playing a bad taste prank. I repaired the scarecrow and placed it back in its original position, but that night, instead of sitting on the porch, I decided to hide in the darkness of the barn, determined to catch the prankster. I spent hours waiting, but nothing happened. Finally, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I was awakened by a chilling sound in the middle of the night. A sharp, spooky scream filled the air, making me jump out of bed. I ran out to the field where my worst nightmare had come true. The scarecrow was standing, teetering on its wooden legs, with its arms swinging grotesquely to the sides. It emitted inhuman moans as it staggered toward the cornfield where the crows had gathered in a terrified black flock. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. It was impossible. A scarecrow couldn't move on its own, but there it was, advancing towards the crows with a malignant determination. The crows took flight in a frenzy of feathers and squawks, fleeing from the living scarecrow. I saw it chase the crows across the field, its maniacal laughter echoing in the night. I ran towards it, trying to grab and stop it, but it pushed me aside with a force that didn't seem possible for a pile of wood and cloth. Finally, the scarecrow returned to its original place in the center of the field as if nothing had happened. Its pumpkin head smiled sinisterly as I looked on in horror. I didn't know what to do or how to explain what I had witnessed. How could a scarecrow come to life and then become inert again? The next day I called a close friend, Tom, to help me investigate what was happening. He was skeptical at first, but after spending a night in the barn with me, he changed his mind. Together we watched the scarecrow for hours, waiting for it to come to life again, but nothing happened. We decided to leave it for the night and return the next day with more tools and surveillance equipment. However, when we came back, we found an even more spooky scene. The scarecrow was surrounded by dead crows, their bodies mangled and torn apart, some with their eyes gouged out and their wings broken. Tom and I looked at each other, stunned and horrified. What kind of creature or human could have done something like this? There was no logical explanation. We tried to investigate, but we found no evidence that could lead us to an answer. The situation only worsened from then on. Every night, the scarecrow came to life and went out into the field, chasing the crows and causing havoc. The corpses of the crows piled up around it, and the ground around the scarecrow became sterile as if it were absorbing the life of everything around it. Stunned and with hearts full of fear, Tom and I decided that the only way to end this nightmare was to destroy the scarecrow once and for all. We armed ourselves with torches and gasoline, prepared to burn it to ashes. As we approached the scarecrow, I noticed that its pumpkin head had a different expression this time. It looked sad, as if it knew what was about to happen. The scarecrow continued to teeter, but when Tom tried to grab it, it seemed to offer little resistance, almost as if it wanted to be freed from its existence. Tom and I exchanged nervous glances as we soaked the wooden and cloth figure with gasoline. When we set fire to the scarecrow, a momentary sense of relief washed over us, but that feeling soon vanished when we began to hear sounds we couldn't believe. From the flames emerged moans and cries, as if the scarecrow were suffering indescribable torment. The screams were distressing, and we could feel the sadness and desperation in each moan. Despite the spooky experience, we couldn't look away, mesmerized by the macabre spectacle before us. Finally, when the flames completely consumed the scarecrow, the sounds abruptly ceased. All that was left was a pile of smoldering ashes. The field fell silent and the air became oppressive, as if something evil had dissipated. Tom and I looked at each other once more, this time with a feeling of relief mixed with unease. The problem of the crows had been solved, but at a cost we couldn't fully understand. We could never explain what happened that night. We decided not to tell anyone else about what we had witnessed, fearing they would think us crazy. Although the field became peaceful again and the crows were no longer a threat, the memory of the living scarecrow and its distressing farewell would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The farm became my world again, but I never tried to create such a spooky scarecrow again. I learned that sometimes it is better to let mysteries remain unsolved, and that some secrets should remain in the shadows where they belong,